Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday, Yom Shishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Paul in the Great Northwest, Gordo in Scotland, Joe in the Inland Empire, Melissa in Great Neck, Yehud in South Carolina, Lorraine in Texas, Franco in Trieste, Italy, Alan in New York City. I'm on my own. Nina had to step out. So I'll be scanning the comments for questions at the end. And I didn't have the system in place for sending out the notification on the app. So I apologize about that. If you're waiting for the app notification, we have to send that out manually when it goes live on YouTube. But hopefully people will find the feed. Anyway, it always lives on both the website and the app afterward, even if you catch it late or a little bit later in the day. Okay, another double daf, thank God. As we we're not struggling, but as we work our way back. But I will give you a heads up that we'll have a normal class schedule today, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then next Thursday. I'm going to be away for a few days. We have a wedding in the family, thank God, but going to be away for a few days. So, yeah, what can we do? We're human. We'll keep it going, and in the not too distant future, we should be caught up and on the schedule. But believe me, there are many Daf Yomi Shirim that run way behind and for a very long time. It's quite the normal thing. And then when there are shorter Dafs, you get caught up. Okay. Our dafs today are pages 7 and 8 here in Tractate Shevuos, the 26th volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1. The tractate is about oaths, but because this first Mishna talked about structurally that when the Torah lists 2 kinds of oaths, it implies that there are 4 kinds of oaths, and so we're looking at 3 other areas. The marks of tzuras, defiling the temple or sacrificial foods while unwittingly tamei, in a state of ritual impurity. What was the third one? Right? Marks of tzuras, defiling, and Shabbos, carrying out on Shabbos. All 3 of those areas of the law have this same structure in some of their laws, where the Torah lists 2 types of situations that actually become 4. And so we're on kind of an extended digression. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about how the sages derive from the Torah. This is where we were yesterday, in the middle of this exposition of how do the sages ascribe for the unwitting violation, when the temple was standing in Jerusalem, if a person was tamei, ritually impure, meaning he came into contact with a source of impurity, like a dead body. And remember, it's not that he made a transgression. That's not a sin. In fact, it might have been a great mitzvah to assist in burying somebody who passed away, attending a funeral, or even participating in the burial itself. And so the person becomes tamei. Beautiful thing to do, important thing to do, but he has come into contact with a source of impurity, so he would have to go through a purification process depending on the source of impurity. Might take a day, might take a few days, including probably immersing in a mikvah, waiting for nightfall, etc., before he could enter the holy temple, the precincts of the holy temple. Let's say he forgot that he was in a state of tumah, that he was tamei. He entered the holy temple, and then he came out when he realized, oh my gosh, I was tamei when I was in the temple. So now there is an offering for that, the sliding scale offering. Sliding scale meaning that if a person is too poor to pay for, let's say, a sheep, he could do it with a bird or with a meal offering. So according to the financial status of the person. But the question was, the sages were able to see in the Torah pretty readily that a person who eats sacrificial foods while tamei brings that offering. But how do we know that a person who is tamei, who enters the temple, is going to bring that same offering? Yesterday at the end of the class, they tried a couple of proofs. didn't work. So let's see if we can find that proof right now. We're picking this up at the very bottom of page 7a. So we have not brought the proof yet that one is liable to bring the sliding scale sin offering for unwittingly defiling the temple by stepping in while tamei. Now looking for that proof. Rather, Rava said it is derived from a verbal analogy between the terms his impurity and his impurity as follows. It is written here with regard to the sliding scale offering. Or if he will touch impurity of a man in any manner of his impurity, through which he can become impure, Leviticus 5:3. And it is written there, now on page 7b, with regard to the red heifer. What's the red heifer? The red heifer is all about how you purify yourself if you come into contact with a dead body, right? There's only been 9 red heifers in the whole history of the Jewish people. They were slaughtered outside the Temple Mount, special procedure. Then they were burned in a fire. All the ashes were collected, the ashes of the red heifer, collected, stored very carefully. And then they would mix some of the ashes of the red heifer with some with water, very pure water, and then there would be a sprinkling accomplished, I think, with a hyssop branch on this person who came into contact with the dead. On the 3rd and 7th days after he came into contact with the dead, then he immerses in the mikveh, waits till nightfall, and then he can step into the holy temple or do whatever he needs to do in a state of purity. Right, but he will be impure until he goes through that process. Okay, so here we're talking about the law of somebody who comes into contact with impurity, and or somebody. Wait, I'm sorry. The law of one who touches impurity, and many. Right, let's just read it again. It is written here with regard to the sliding scale offering, or if he will touch impurity of a man in any manner of his impurity through which he can become impure, meaning while he's impure and then he comes into contact with holy things. That's what the sliding scale offering is. And it is written there with regard to the red heifer. Whoever touches the corpse of a man who died and is not sprinkled, he will have contaminated the tabernacle of God. He will be impure. His impurity is still upon him, from Numbers 19:13. So this verbal analogy teaches that just as there the verse is referring to the defiling of the temple, so too here the sliding scale offering is brought to atone for the defiling of the temple. And the Gemara asks, but if so, why do I need the term through which? The Gemara earlier derived from this term that one who is impure and unwittingly eats teruma, consecrated food that only priests can eat, he is not liable to bring the sliding scale offering. This wouldn't apply, that sliding scale offering would not apply to that situation. The Gemara has now derived that the sliding scale offering atones specifically for the unwitting defiling of the temple. If so, it is obvious that one is not liable for unwittingly eating teruma, and the phrase is superfluous. So the Gemara answers the term through which serves to include one who was rendered impure by eating the nevela, unslaughtered carcass, right? In other words, a kosher animal that is not slaughtered in a kosher manner. That's known as a nevela, and so it is not permitted for a Jew to eat that. It is a kosher animal, but because it wasn't slaughtered in a kosher manner, it becomes not permitted. That's called the nevela. So the term through which serves to include one who was rendered impure by eating the nevela of a kosher bird. Unlike other impure items which render impure any person who touches them, the nevela of a bird renders a person impure only if he eats it. Therefore, one might have thought he would not be liable for entering the temple if he was rendered impure by having eaten the nevela of a bird. The extra term is therefore necessary to teach that one is liable. Now the Gemara challenges this, but didn't you say above that the term through which is a restriction? How can you now use it to include additional cases? And the Gemara explains it is precisely because it is a restriction that it includes additional cases. Huh? You just said that we had a general statement and then a restriction. So that should limit the cases that the generality applies to. How can you say that a restriction is going to amplify? It's going to now bring in more cases. But that's exactly what it's going to do. Why? Because of the double negative. As it is written, the beginning of that verse, or if he will touch an impurity of a man, which indicates that one who is impure with a form of impurity that can impart impurity through touching, yes, he is liable for defiling the temple by entering it in his impure state. But if one is impure with a form of impurity that cannot impart impurity through touching, then one would not be liable. Therefore, the verse opens with a restriction, and when the verse continues, and it is written through which is also a restriction, this constitutes a restriction after a restriction. And a restriction after a restriction serves only to amplify the law, applying it to additional cases. Let me read you the note on this. Will explain it better than I could. The hermeneutical principle, a restriction after a restriction serves only to amplify, is unrelated to the phenomenon that occurs in many languages where a double negative indicates a positive. That's not what we're saying here, right? But this idea of the double negative indicates a positive, right? When you say, hey, are you going to come to the party? And you say, well, I'm not saying that I won't come. Kind of means you're going to come, right? The double negative is a positive. And then there's the old joke, well, we have found that the double negative equals a positive in many, many languages, but we have never found a case, said a famous linguist at a linguist conference from the dais. But in all our research, we have never found a case of a double positive that indicates a negative. And Shmuel in the back of the room says, yeah. Anyway. The double negative becomes a positive is not what we're talking about when we say a restriction after a restriction serves to amplify. Why? The principle does not relate specifically to negative terms such as but or only. It relates to restrictive phrases that limit the scope of the law. So the principle follows this logic. If the Torah states a law and then writes a single restrictive expression that concerns that law, so it is assumed that the expression was written to limit the scope of that law, to limit the number of cases in which that law applies. But once there are two restrictive expressions, it is apparent that they are not written to limit the scope of this law, but because one such expression would have sufficed for that. Rather, the fact that there are two such expressions indicates that they are merely examples of the law, and consequently should not be understood as serving to limit the scope of the law. Therefore, whereas that one limiting example would have served to restrict the scope of the law, when a second is listed, we see, oh, those were just examples. So we cancel, so to speak, the restriction that the first example would have imposed, and now we just would apply the law more generally wherever it seems fitting to apply that law. That's why restriction after restriction amplifies. New subject. Now, our Mishna, the first Mishna in this chapter, continues for cases in which one had awareness at the beginning, but then transgressed during a lapse of awareness and still had no awareness at the end, right? He went to Jerusalem for the holiday when the temple was standing. He went to a funeral that morning. He came into contact with the dead. He was tamei. And then in the excitement of the festival, he forgot he was tamei. He entered the holy temple and he never realized that he was tamei and had done that. So he knew in the beginning, but then he forgot. And he remains ignorant of what he did even after. So of course he can't make an atonement because he doesn't realize that he made a transgression. If he finally realized that there was a transgression, then he has awareness at the end. So this is awareness at the beginning, then lapse of awareness while it's happening, and continuing lapse of awareness afterward. What's going to make an atonement for him? He can't atone for himself. He doesn't know he did something wrong. So where does the atonement come? The goat whose blood presentation is performed inside the sanctuary on Yom Kippur, and all the avoda of the high priest and all the sacrifices that are brought in the holy temple on the holiday of Yom Kippur itself. These atone for these kinds of unwitting violations. And when we say that Yom Kippur itself, well, we don't have the avoda, right? We don't have the scapegoat and the other goat, the additional offerings, etc., and all the work of the high priest that's done on Yom Kippur. But we do still have Yom Kippur, right? So Yom Kippur atones. In this case, it is relevant to the Holy Temple or sacrificial foods. We don't have those, but if we did, and when they did, so people who committed transgressions with regard to sacrificial foods and entering the temple while tamei and didn't know it, so these the internal, right, the goat that is sacrificed on the additional offering of a goat that is sacrificed on Yom Kippur, not the scapegoat or the other goat, but the goat that's blood is presented inside, this atones for that unwitting violation. Right? And Yom Kippur itself suspend any punishment that he deserves until he becomes aware of his transgression, at which point he must bring the sliding scale offering. He's not off the hook forever. He committed this transgression. If he never realizes, okay, then he was off the hook. But if he does realize he did this, then he has to bring the sliding scale offering. The sages taught in a Baraisa, the verse states, with regard to the internal goat offering, and he shall effect atonement upon the sanctuary from the impurities of the children of Israel and from their acts of rebellion for all their sins in Leviticus 16:16. With regard to this matter, i.e. the atonement effected by the sacrifice of the goat, I can state that this verse serves to amplify the atonement by teaching that the goat offering atones for the following three sins, which the Torah is referring to as impurities. The impurity of the sin of idol worship, and the impurity of engaging in forbidden sexual relations, and the impurity of perpetrating bloodshed. So the Baraisa demonstrates that each of these three sins is referred to as impurity. With regard to idol worship, the verse states, for he had given his offspring to Moloch in order to render impure my sanctuary. Leviticus 20, verse 3. With regard to forbidden sexual relations, the verse states, you shall safeguard my charge not to do any of the abominable traditions that were done before you and not to render you impure through them. Leviticus 18:30. And with regard to bloodshed, the verse states, the land will not atone for the blood that was spilled on it, except through the blood of the one who spilled it. You shall not render the land impure. Numbers 35:34. One might have thought that the goat offering would atone for these three types of impurities. To counter this, the verse states, from the impurities of the children of Israel, and the restrictive term from indicates that it atones for some impurities, but not all impurities. And in fact, these are the three that if someone puts a gun to your head and says, I'm going to kill you unless you go murder Charlie, so then you're not allowed to murder Charlie. You have to take that bullet. You're not, because Charlie's blood is not, your blood is not redder than Charlie's. You're not allowed to, say that, well, I was under duress and he was going to kill me unless I killed Charlie, so I killed Charlie. You can't kill Charlie. And if somebody says, gun to your head, I'm going to kill you unless you go rape that woman, you can't go rape that woman. And even avodah zarah, I'm going to put a gun to your head unless you bow to this idol. You're obligated to not bow to the idol, not commit the rape, not commit the murder. A lot of people under that kind of pressure would bow to the idol, and then they have to make an atonement for that. But to rape the woman or commit murder, please God, we'd never be in that situation. And if we are, that we're going to do the right thing, which is don't do that. The Baraisa derives the type of impurity for which the goat offering does atone. So what do we find is the impurity that the verse differentiates from all other impurities? You must say that the verse is referring to the defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods. It is specifically for this transgression that the Torah provides one with the means of achieving atonement, i.e., by bringing the sliding scale sin offering that we've been talking about. That there's atonements for other types of things, but this atonement is for this particular issue of while tamei, eating sacrificial foods or entering the holy temple. So too here, since the verse limits the atonement of the goat offering to transgressions involving impurity, it is logical that it can also atone only for the defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says, it is not necessary to derive which transgressions the goat offering atones for by comparing the verse written concerning it to a different verse. Rather, from its own place, i.e. from the verse about the atonement effected by the goat itself, it can be determined as it states, quote, and he shall effect atonement upon the sanctuary, HaKodesh, from the impurities of the children of Israel, which should be interpreted as saying that it atones for the defiling of anything sacred, Kodesh, i.e. the temple or its sacrificial foods. So the Baraisa continues, one might have thought that this goat offering would atone for all cases of the defiling of the temple, even when there was awareness at the beginning and at the end. To counter this, the verse states, and from the acts of rebellion for all their sins, which indicates that the goat offering atones only for sins that are similar to acts of rebellion, just as it atones for acts of rebellion that are not subject to atonement through an offering, as sin offerings brought by an individual are brought only for unwitting sins, not intentional sins. So too, it atones only for sins that are not subject to atonement through an offering. As long as one does not become aware of his sin, it cannot be atoned for through the sliding scale offering. Accordingly, this particular goat on Yom Kippur atones for it. The Baraisa continues, and from where is it derived for a case in which one had awareness at the beginning but did not have awareness at the end, that this goat suspends the punishment that he deserved until he becomes aware of his transgression? And the verse states, for all their sins, from which it is indicated that a goat offering atones only for those who are potentially liable to bring a sin offering, i.e. the sliding scale offering, should they become aware of their sin. The Gemara clarifies some of the details of the Baraisa. The master said, with regard to this matter, I can state that this verse serves to amplify the atonement by teaching that the goat offering atones for the following three sins, which the Torah is referring to as impurities. The impurity of the sin of idol worship, the impurity of engaging in forbidden sexual relations, and the impurity of perpetrating bloodshed. The Gemara asks concerning this sin of idol worship, for which one might have thought that the goat would atone, what are the circumstances? If you say the reference is to a case where he transgressed intentionally, then one can counter that he is subject to the death penalty, and no offering will atone for his sin. And if you say the reference is to a case where he transgressed unwittingly, then one can counter that he is liable to bring his own sin offering for his transgression, and the goat will not atone for him. So the Gemara answers, the goat offering of Yom Kippur atones in a case where he transgressed intentionally, but witnesses did not forewarn him about his transgression, and therefore he is not liable to receive the death penalty. It also atones in a case where he transgressed unwittingly, but by the time Yom Kippur arrived, he still had not become aware of his transgression, and therefore he was not liable to bring an offering. Now we're on page 8a. And the Gemara asks further, with regard to forbidden sexual relations, for which one might have thought the goat offering would atone as well, what are the circumstances? If you say the reference is to a case where he transgressed intentionally, then one can counter that he is subject to the death penalty, and so no offering will atone for his sin. And if you say the reference is to a case where he transgressed unwittingly, well, then one can counter that he is liable to bring his own sin offering for his transgression, so the goat will not atone for him. And the Gemara answers, the goat offering atones in a case where he transgressed intentionally, but witnesses did not forewarn him about his transgression, so he's not liable to receive the death penalty. And it also atones in a case where he transgressed unwittingly, but by the time Yom Kippur arrived, he still did not become aware of his transgression, so he was not liable to bring that offering, the sin offering. The Gemara asks further concerning the bloodshed, for which one might have thought that the goat would atone as well. What are the circumstances? If you say he transgressed intentionally, then he would be subject to the death penalty. And if you say it was unwittingly, then one can counter that he is subject to go to exile. Right? This would be manslaughter, so he would go to exile, to the city of refuge. The Gemara answers, the goat offering atones in a case where he transgressed intentionally, but witnesses did not forewarn him, Or he transgressed unwittingly, but by the time Yom Kippur arrived, he had still not become aware of the transgression. Alternatively, it is referring to those cases for which the perpetrator is not subject to exile. For example, where the death was caused in a way that was almost unavoidable, or where it was very close to being considered intentional, so exile would not apply. Next subject. The Gemara continues to analyze the next part of this baraisa. The master said, one might have thought that the goat offering would atone for these three types of impurities. And to counter this, the verse states, from the impurities of the children of Israel. And the restrictive term from indicates that it atones for some impurities, but not all impurities. What do we find is the impurity that the verse differentiates from all other impurities? We find it with regard to the defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods. It is specifically for this transgression that the Torah provides one with the means of achieving atonement, i.e. bringing the sliding scale sin offering. So too, here, since the verse limits the atonement of the goat offering to transgressions involving impurity, it is logical that it can atone only for the defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara asks, in what way does the Torah differentiate the impurity of this transgression from other types of transgressions? It is differentiated in that one brings a sliding scale offering to atone for it. But if that is a sufficient distinction, then say instead that the goat offering atones for idol worship. And in what way does the Torah differentiate it from the other types of transgressions? And before answering, the Gemara interjects with a mnemonic device to help us remember which cases it will suggest the goat offering should atone for. Idolatry, a woman after childbirth, the Mitzorah, or the Nazir. So, going back to the question, it is differentiated in that he brings a she-goat as a sin offering and not a ewe, right? A sheep, which is the animal brought as a sin offering for other transgressions. Rav Kahana said, we said that the goat offering should atone for a transgression that the Torah differentiates in order to be lenient relative to other transgressions. But this case of idolatry is one that the Torah differentiates in order to be stringent relative to other transgressions. Accordingly, the verse cannot be referring to idolatry. And the Gemara asks, well, why not say instead that the goat offering atones for a woman after childbirth? We saw yesterday, a woman after childbirth is considered to be in a state of impurity for a certain amount of time, and therefore cannot come into contact with holy things. And that's what we learned out from the woman after childbirth, that a Kohen cannot eat holy foods for the same reason, if he is tamei. Why not say instead that the goat offering atones for a woman after childbirth, as the Torah differentiates her from other people who must bring a sin offering following a period of impurity, in that she brings a sliding scale offering, whereas others bring the fixed offering? Rav Hoshaya said the verse states for all their sins in Leviticus 16:16. It does not state for all their impurities. Accordingly, since the offering brought by a woman after childbirth is not to atone for a sin, but due to the fact that she went through a period of ritual impurity, the goat offering will not atone for her. Now the Gemara asks, but if so, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who says a woman after childbirth brings an offering because she is also a sinner, then what is there to say? Under the intense pain of childbirth, a woman is apt to make an oath not to engage in intercourse again in order to avoid becoming pregnant again and going through this painful experience. This is regarded as a sin because she will certainly violate that oath. The Gemara answers, Rabbi Shimon conforms to his line of reasoning, as he said in the Baraisa, from its own place, i.e. from the verse about the atonement of the goat offering itself, it can be determined what this goat offering atones for. So the Gemara asks, why not say that the goat offering atones for a Mitzorah, as the Torah differentiates him from other people who must bring a fixed offering following a period of impurity, and that he brings a sliding scale offering? And Rav Hoshaya said, the verse states for all their sins and not for all their impurities. Accordingly, since the offering brought by a Mitzorah is not to atone for a sin, right? A Mitzorah just goes through the period of Tzuras, and then he completes his purification by bringing certain offerings. It's not that he committed a sin, although Tzuras tsaras is considered something that arises from lashon hara or other misdeeds, we don't know exactly what it is that caused it. And the offerings that come at the end of a period of tsaras are not being brought for a sin, they're just being brought for purification. So accordingly, since the offering brought by a mitzvah is not to atone for a sin, the goat offering will not atone for him. The Gemara asks, but if so, according to, and remember, we're still trying to work out the proof of how we know that the sliding scale sin offering can be brought, should be brought, by a person who was tamei and knew it, then had a lapse of awareness and entered the holy temple, either because he forgot that he was tamei when he entered, or he realized that he was tamei, but he didn't realize he was entering the temple. And then later he became aware that he entered the temple while he was tamei, and so he has to bring the sin offering to make an atonement. But that's not explicitly stated in the Torah, and we're deriving that. And they're looking at all these different possibilities of how we derive that law. And, more recently, we've been looking at the goats of Yom Kippur and how they affect atonement. But they affect atonement for people who possibly didn't know, that they didn't become aware later. In fact, if they did become aware, then they have to bring that sin offering. If they didn't become aware, then that goat might atone for them in certain circumstances. But it's such a, if we take a step back for a second, it's such a complex body of law, right? It seems like logically we should arrive at this outcome that sliding scale sin offering atones for this particular deed, but they can't just say that, right? The sages are only going to derive such a law if there's a firm basis for it in the Torah. And so if we take this step back and say, wow, Judaism, Torah law, to live as a righteous Jew, right? To live as a Torah law abiding Jew. It's so complicated. To just know what you're supposed to do in any situation is so difficult, right? Now, of course, we're not meant to figure these things out ourselves. We have sages, thank God, right? And the sages figure it out for us. And then they codify it for us, and then they teach it to the community, and then the community teaches it to their families, right? And it gets passed down through the generations, and nonetheless, many questions come up all the time. And so you have to have a Rav. You have to have a rabbi who's very well versed in the law that you can bring your questions to. And sometimes a question is new. And the very learned Rav, he doesn't know what the answer is. And he goes to a more learned rabbi, a paskening rabbi, and then to the Gedolim, the great rabbis of a generation, will figure out the answers to questions that no one else can figure out. But just think of that in terms of God designing a system that is so complicated and has so much nuance that it's just not obvious how to live according to Torah law. Why would God design a system that is so complex? Perhaps because in order to live by that system, to abide by that system, to flourish in that system, you have to be learning. The community as a whole, the tribe as a whole, has to be learning. There have to be scholars learning in every generation. And there has to be a certain amount of learning even by the regular rank and file people, so that they know at least enough to ask questions and to know that this is a situation where, hey, you know what, I'm not sure what the answer is. I need to get some help. Just to know that, right, to know to ask the question requires the people to be learned at some level. And so creating such a system has ensured that the Jewish people would keep learning Torah in every generation. And that's why we have an unbroken learning tradition stretching back 3,000 years. And in that learning that we do, in that learning that we're doing right now, sometimes it's complicated, sometimes it's hard to follow, sometimes we feel overwhelmed by it, some days we have amazing breakthroughs. But at all times, we're coming into contact with the tradition and with the minds of our sages and with the whole outlook of what God is trying to share with us through these laws. We're engaging in Torah, right? We are engaging in Torah. And so this tradition says that when we pray, we talk to God. When we learn, we hear God speaking with us. Not only through a text that was delivered 3,000 years ago, but through an ever-living text that we as a people have been studying for all these 3,000 years and engaging in. That's how I feel about that. So let's get back to where I was. I can figure out where I was. Oh my gosh. Where was I exactly? Yeah, the woman after childbirth. Yeah. Okay, so the Gemara asks, why not say that the goat offering atones for a metzora, as the Torah differentiates him from other people who must bring the fixed offering, and Rav Hoshaya said for all their sins, not for all their impurities. So the Gemara asks, but if so, according to Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, who says that the marks of a metzora come upon a person for 7 matters, i.e. 7 different sins. You just said it. The metzora doesn't bring his offerings because he committed a sin. But according to Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, he did commit a sin. That's why he became a metzora. And then what are the 7 marks, right? There are 7 different sins. So according to this view, what is there to say? And the Gemara answers there, it is his mark of tzaras that atones for his sin. And the offering is brought to permit him to re-enter the congregation after having been ostracized while he was a metzora. The suffering of being a metzora atones for the sins that brought on the tzaras, right? There's 7 sins listed here, but like the main one that we understand, we always talk about is lashon hara, evil speech, gossiping about others, right? Spreading malicious lies or false reports, testifying falsely, but especially just gossiping, sharing things that are true, that shouldn't be spoken about other people at any time. We should not be talking about other people because it hurts them, hurts us, and hurts the person we're speaking with. So interesting that the idea is that the tzaras is the atonement, right? Our afflictions are an atonement for our sins. The sin offerings that the metzora brings after he's cured of the tzaras, that's just to purify him and bring him back into the congregation. The Gemara asks, but why not say that the goat offering atones for a nazir who became tamei, as the Torah differentiates him from other people who must bring an offering following a period of impurity, in that he brings doves or young pigeons. The nazir is the one who took a vow to abstain from products of the grapevine, he will not cut his hair, and he will not come into contact with the dead during the period of his naziris, like Samson, who was a lifelong nazir. Rav Hoshaya said the verse states for all their sins and not for all their impurities. Accordingly, since the offering brought by the nazir is not to atone for a sin, but just to end his naziris, the goat offering will not atone for him. What's going to be the challenge? But if so, according to Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, who says that a nazir is a sinner. Why is a nazir a sinner? Didn't he try to just elevate himself to a higher level of holiness by taking this vow? Not to drink wine, not to cut his hair, not to come in contact with the dead, just be on a higher level of holiness? How is he a sinner? But he unnecessarily abstained from wine. Isn't that interesting, right? If you're an alcoholic and you vow never to have wine to save your life, of course, laudable, amazing thing. But if you don't have a problem with it, and you just say, no, I want to be holier, and so you take a vow not to drink wine, well then, something that is permitted to you by God, you rendered prohibited through that vow. And wine in particular, I mean, first of all, anything that is permitted to us and that we never sample in our lives, we're going to be accountable for that because that's a gift that God gave you that you didn't take advantage of, so to speak. But wine in particular, because it's associated with making kiddush, right? We make kiddush. We sanctify the day by drinking some wine and saying a blessing over it and drinking wine. So the wine is very important as a sacramental substance in our tradition. So somebody who renders wine prohibited to him and therefore cannot make kiddush with wine, you could say that he is a sinner. Rabbi Elazar HaKapar does say that. A Nazir is also a sinner because he unnecessarily abstained from wine. So then what is there to say? Well, you say he's not a sinner. According to this view, he is a sinner. And the Gemara answers, he holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who says in the Baraisa, from its own place, i.e. from the verse about atonement of the goat itself, it can be determined what the goat offering atones for. Okay, let's continue analyzing this Baraisa. The master said, Rabbi Shimon says, it is not necessary to derive which transgressions the goat offering atones for by comparing the verse written concerning it to a different verse, rather from its own place, i.e. from the verse about the atonement effected by the goat itself. It can be determined, as it states, and he shall effect atonement upon the sanctuary from the impurities of the children of Israel, which should be interpreted, according to Rabbi Shimon, as saying that it atones for the defiling of anything sacred, kodesh, i.e. the temple or its sacrificial foods. Right, but isn't teruma kodesh? That's something else. The Gemara explains Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, asking, Rabbi Shimon is saying well. Why does Rabbi Yehuda disagree? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yehuda could have said to you, that verse is necessary to teach that in the same manner that he performs the blood presentation in the innermost sanctum of this goat on Yom Kippur, i.e. in the Holy of Holies, that is how he shall later perform them in the sanctuary. The Gemara asks, and how does Rabbi Shimon derive that law? The law is derived from the continuation of the verse. And so shall he do in the tent of meeting. This is the sanctuary. So the Gemara asks, and what does Rabbi Yehuda derive from that part of the verse? The Gemara explains he holds that if the halacha, the law, would be derived only from that part of the verse, I would say that he should bring another bull and goat, slaughter them, and perform the blood presentations in the sanctuary with their blood. Therefore, the first part of the verse, and he shall effect atonement upon the sanctuary, teaches us that all the presentations that the Kohen Gadol makes on Yom Kippur are made with blood from the same bull and goat. And the Gemara asks, and why does Rabbi Shimon not need the first part of the verse to derive this? And the Gemara explains that the verse, and so shall he do to the tent of meeting, itself indicates that the blood used in the tent of meeting, i.e. the sanctuary, is from the same bull and goat. Next part of the Baraisa. The master said one might have thought that this goat offering would atone for all cases of defiling the temple, even where there was awareness at the beginning and at the end. To counter this, the verse states, and from their acts of rebellion for all their sins, which indicates that the goat offering atones only for transgressions which, with regard to the perpetrator, transgressions with which to, it indicates that the goat offering atones only for transgressions with regard to which the perpetrator is not subject to bring an offering brought by an individual to atone for himself. The Gemara asks, right, if you can atone yourself because you're aware that you did something unwittingly, then the goat of Yom Kippur will not atone for you. You need to bring your own goat. The goat of Yom Kippur will only atone for you if you don't realize that you need to bring your own goat. And so it's a kind of catch-all so that the Jewish people won't, possibly die that year with their sin upon them. The Gemara asks, what is the case for which the goat offering does not atone, where one had awareness at the beginning and had awareness at the end? Well, the Gemara objects immediately. But the person in that case is subject to atonement through an offering. If you have awareness before that you were tamei, and you have awareness after that you entered the temple while you were tamei, now you have to bring the sliding scale offering. Why would the goat of Yom Kippur atone for that? If so, even with this verse, it should be obvious that the goat offering would not atone for him and would absolve him from his obligation to bring an offering. But the Gemara explains, no. The verse is necessary to teach that the goat does not atone for him in a case in which he became aware of his transgression close to sunset before the onset of Yom Kippur, and even though he was liable to bring the sliding scale offering, he didn't have time to do it. In such a case, it might enter your mind to say that until he brings his sliding scale offering the day after Yom Kippur, the goat would suspend any punishment that he deserved. Therefore, the verse teaches us that since the transgression is of a type that is subject to an offering brought by an individual, the goat does not effect any atonement for it. He will have to bring that offering. We're on page 8b. The Gemara cites the next part of the Baraisa. The master said, from where is it derived that if a person had awareness at the beginning but did not have awareness at the end, he never realized he committed this sin, that this goat suspends the punishment that he deserved until he becomes aware of his transgression? The Gemara challenges, why does the Baraisa ask, from where is it derived? What is it that the Baraisa finds difficult about this, that it searches for a proof for it? And the Gemara explains, this is what the Baraisa finds difficult. Now that you have said that the goat atones only for sins that are similar to acts of rebellion, such that just as it atones for acts of rebellion that are not subject to atonement through an offering, so too it atones only for sins that are not subject to atonement through an offering. Why not compare them in a more restrictive manner and say, just as it atones only for acts of rebellion that are never subject to atonement through an offering, so too it atones or suspends punishment only for sins that are never and will never be subject to atonement through an offering. Why not say that? And what types of transgressions are they? They are cases where one did not have awareness at the beginning, but he did have awareness at the end. But where he had awareness at the beginning, but did not have awareness at the end, since when he becomes aware he is subject to an offering, one could say that the goat will not even suspend punishment. And if you would say that the comparison should not be understood in this way, because for one who did not have awareness at the beginning, but he did have awareness at the end, he didn't realize he was tamei when he became tamei, but later he realized, oh my gosh, I was tamei and I did enter the temple, right? So he has awareness at the end. The goat whose blood presentation is performed outside the sanctuary and Yom Kippur itself atone, well, if you said that, it would be difficult. If atonement is achieved through them, it is unnecessary for the verse to teach that atonement is not affected by the internal goat. Perforce, the comparison must be understood as the Baraisa presents it. What then is the difficulty of the Baraisa? And the Gemara explains, it could enter your mind to say that we should reverse our conclusions about which offering atones for which type of transgression. In other words, one could say that the internal goat atones for the sin of one who did not have awareness at the beginning, and the external goat atones for the sin of one who did not have awareness at the beginning. If so, the comparison could be fully extended, as the Gemara suggested, and accordingly, one could have thought that the internal goat would not atone for the one who had awareness at the beginning. And to counter this, the verse states for all their sins, which indicates, by inference, that the internal goat atones only for those who are potentially liable to bring the sin offering, meaning the sliding scale offering, should they become aware of their sin. The Gemara challenges this view. But let one who is still not aware of his transgression achieve complete atonement, so that even should he later become aware of his transgression, he will not have to bring a sin offering. Why does the Baraisa say that the goat only suspends punishment? Why not just let it affect the atonement, since he doesn't know at that time? And the Gemara answers, if it were written from their sins, it would be interpreted as you say. But now that it is written for all their sins, this indicates that it is referring to those whose sins, it is referring to those sins whose commission will potentially cause the transgressor to become subject to an obligation to bring a sin offering. The Gemara asks, but once it has been determined that the goat does not affect a complete atonement, to what end does it suspend punishment? And Rabbi Zera said, the Baraisa means to say that if he dies before he brings his offering, he dies without liability for his sin. And Rava said to him, if he dies, he does not need the offering to atone for him, since death itself cleanses him of all his sins. Rather, Rava said there is a different explanation. The Baraisa means to say that the goat serves to protect him from being punished with suffering before he has brought his offering. The Mishnah teaches, for cases in which one did not have awareness at the beginning, but he had awareness at the end, the goat whose blood presentation is performed outside the sanctuary, i.e. the goat of the additional offerings of Yom Kippur and Yom Kippur itself atone. This is derived from the fact that the Torah juxtaposes the internal and external goats to teach that both atone only for cases in which one had awareness of his transgression at some point, although each offering atones in a different case. About this, the Gemara comments, now the verse juxtaposes the two goats with each other to teach that they effect atonement for similar cases. But then, let the internal goat atone both for itself, i.e. for the cases that it normally atones for, and for that which the external goat normally atones for. And the practical difference will be in a case where, for some reason, the service of the external goat was not performed. And the Gemara explains, the verse states, Aaron shall bring atonement upon the corners once a year, with the blood of the sin offering of atonement once in the year. Shall he make atonement for it throughout your generations? Exodus 30:10. And the emphasis of the repeated term, once, teaches that the goat effects atonement for only one case, but it cannot effect two atonements for two different cases. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. The Gemara challenges, but then let the external goat atone both for itself, i.e. for cases that it normally atones for, and for that which the internal goat normally atones for. And the practical difference will be in a case of the defiling of the temple or sacrificial foods that occurred between the offering of this goat and that goat. Okay. On Yom Kippur, the person became tamei, and he stepped into the temple in a lapse of awareness that occurred during the sprinkling of the blood of one goat and the other of Yom Kippur. Very specific case. The Gemara explains. The verse states, Aaron shall bring atonement upon its corners once a year. The emphasis on the term once a year teaches that this atonement, for the specific case that it atones for, should be only once a year. Now we're on page 9a. According to the Mishna, the internal goat atones for a case in which there was no awareness at the beginning, but there was awareness at the end. And the Gemara asks, according to Rabbi Yishmael, who says, for a case in which one did not have awareness at the beginning, but did have awareness at the end, the person is liable to bring an offering. For what does the goat whose blood presentation is performed outside the sanctuary atone? And the Gemara answers, it atones for a case in which he did not have awareness, neither in the beginning nor in the end. He never knew. He didn't know he became tamei. He didn't know he came into contact with the holy, either by stepping in the temple or eating sacrificial foods while tamei, and he never found out later. So he definitely needs the goat of Yom Kippur to atone for him, because he will never know that he needs to bring an atonement himself. Gemara challenges this answer, but for that case, the goats of the festivals and the goats of the new moons atone. One who never found out, neither in the beginning nor the end. The Gemara explains, he holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says the atonement effected by all the goats offered as part of the additional offerings, i.e. those of the new moons, the festivals, and Yom Kippur, is the same. They all atone for various cases of the defiling of the temple and its sacrificial foods. And the Gemara asks, but if Rabbi Yishmael holds that the internal goat atones for a situation in which there was no awareness at all, with regard to what law does the Torah juxtapose the internal goat with the external goat? And the Gemara explains the juxtaposition teaches that just as the internal goat does not atone for other transgressions, so too the external goat does not atone for other transgressions. Rather, they both atone only for the defiling of the temple and its sacrificial foods. Not easy. Not easy. Okay. Debbie says, I am glad that you shared your thoughts about this complicated and confusing information. I was thanking God that we no longer have to sacrifice animals. No, we don't. But we do have to keep learning the laws. Torah cannot be defiled, not defined. Wait, says Sharon. What are you saying? Oh, that was answering a question. Can the temple actually be defiled? Okay. I'm sorry. There's a conversation going on. Right. Sharon said, can the temple actually be defiled? We know a Torah scroll cannot be defiled. I think that's what you meant, not defined. So can the temple itself actually be defiled just by someone entering who is tamei? Right. And I think that's really a quirk of English, the way that we're using this. It's the way they're translating it. But of course they don't mean that the temple becomes tamei. The temple cannot become tamei, right? But we commit a sin by entering it when we are tamei, or by eating sacrificials when we are. Now there, it's interesting, right? You can defile foods. If you are tamei and you come into contact with sacrificial foods, right, you will render them tamei and no longer fit for others to eat, even if they are pure. But that's actually not what we're talking about, right? It's not about whether you transmit the impurity to the food, but you ate the sacrificial food when you weren't supposed to because you're tamei. But in terms of the temple itself, no, right? The temple doesn't become tamei, But what they mean when they say defiled the temple is that we entered it while we were tamei. That's a transgression, but it doesn't impart that impurity to the temple. And maybe that's why they say when we're talking about what is kodesh, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that are holy, but what remains holy no matter what, right, is the holy temple. And Michelle says, I'm thanking God also that animal sacrifices are no longer a requirement. And Gordo says, phew, thank you, Sal and Nina. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. It is Lag BaOmer. May you be experiencing it in great joy. And as we enter Shabbos tonight, may we hear only good news. May it be a peaceful and uplifting and rejuvenating Shabbos. And may we emerge from Shabbos hearing only good news. With God's help, we'll have class tomorrow night with our heroes on the East Coast who are tuning in well past midnight. I'm trying to get on as quickly as I can. I think last week it was more like 9:25, but somewhere between 9:15. 9:15 is probably unrealistic, but closer to 9:30. But as early as I possibly can, somewhere there, let's say between 9:20 and 9:30 p.m. Pacific tomorrow night for our next class. All the best. Good Shabbos.